Throughout his pilgrimage with the disciples, Jesus taught them how to refine their spiritual practices, the practice of paying attention, the practice of feeling pain, the practice of living with a purpose, and the practice of being present to God. Today we are going to discuss the ways in which he helped them understand what it means to practice, cultivate hope. And this is where we find Mary, Peter, and John at the tomb in search of hope. As the disciples stand in front of and then enter the empty tomb, I suspect the picture that they formed in their mind was a picture of tragedy. The idea that Jesus had died and now someone has gone so far as to steal his body. I imagine they thought some of the enemies of Jesus did this, that some of the folks who wanted to silence his voice in his movement of justice and love because he was breaking cultural norms and boundaries by including all, by extending compassion to all people. They stood in front of this tomb searching for hope. Now, I define hope as a future thing, an object, or a state of being that we hope for. We hope for something that is difficult, but we understand it to be possible to obtain. In this sense, it was difficult for Mary, Peter, and the beloved disciple to make sense of what had happened, what was going to happen. But had they lived in the presence of Jesus, I suspect that they knew it was possible for them to grow in understanding. I believe hope is best understood as a virtue, as a spiritual practice that exists between the extremes of despair and presumption. You see, despair is the absence of hope fed by fear. Despair is the sense that we cannot work against fate. It surrenders the future to an imagined dystopia. You see, despair is nostalgic. Despair is nostalgic because it allows you to misremember history, to create a false narrative, right? To believe that things perhaps existed in a way that they never have. So when you hear someone say, "Make America great again," you see, this is the cry of a people in despair. And people fighting, arguing for an idea of a past, an imagined reality that never actually existed. Because despair is guided by fear, it numbs the conscience against all wrongdoing. So, political figures and some conservative Christian leaders, they can use despair to manipulate people. They can use despair to convince them that all of their problems in their life are because of the behavior of others. This is why you are suffering. It's because of what other people are doing. This is why our country is suffering. So we need to control their reproductive rights, because somehow that'll make your life better. Or we need to control what children can read in schools, because somehow that's going to make you feel better about yourself. Or let's control what college they can attend and make it difficult for anyone who doesn't come from family wealth to get into one of these elite institutions. To be sure, I don't want to pretend that it's only people with bad intentions that can be led to despair. Good people, people like Judas, can be led to despair. Good people, I believe, who do not do their inner work, do not avoid looking critically at themselves, because we are all capable of sin. We are all capable of failing to love, and we don't look at our shadow sides and assess the ways in which we need to grow closer to God. We can be led to despair. Now, the other extreme, the opposite of despair, is presumption. So rather than a lack of hope, presumption is a misplaced hope. Presumption takes the form of hoping that things would just work out in the natural course of our lives. Presumption is what allowed the Voting Rights Act to be gutted, because we assumed, right, that all of a sudden they were going to allow people of color and poor people and elderly to just vote. We assumed that these people weren't acting with any kind of racial bias anymore because it wasn't explicit in their language. Rather, it was implicit in their behavior. Presumption is what allowed Roe v. Wade to be overturned, because we assumed that that would never get overturned. Of course, this is one of the bedrocks of our social progress. This will Presumption is what allowed a reality TV star to not be taken seriously as a presidential candidate until it was far too late. However, we do not see despair and presumption in this passage. Rather, what the beloved disciple shows us, what Mary begins to show us, are the beginnings of hope. Verse 8 tells us that when the beloved disciple went inside the tomb and saw the linens that covered Jesus' face folded up, it says he saw and believed. That he saw the linens folded up neatly. And he had this transformation internally where he believed. He didn't quite know what was happening, but he believed. He didn't understand all that was taking place, but he believed. He believed that God was at work, and he saw and recognized that he didn't understand everything, but that in fact something was happening, that God was happening. He understood that even though some of his fellow disciples were concerned that this was the end of their movement, this movement that Jesus had created, he understood this was not the end. Rather, it was a new beginning. Seeing the empty tomb for him reignited his hope. And so what I would love for you to do in the pews with the people surrounding you, just to spend a few minutes thinking about this question that is in your bulletin, if you ever pick one up. And the question is, where do you see the vices of despair and presumption? And even what role does hope play in your spiritual life?